Throughout the 19th century, people in America existed along seemingly strict lines of gender and race. With each position came an expectation for a way of life, leading to lasting gender and racial stereotypes. Throughout the study of women's experiences in early America, it is easy to draw the conclusion that gender stereotypes projected women to be dainty, fragile, and pious. In comparison, men were here to be strong, intelligent, and highly respected. Yet, when we look further into the ways that race divided the gender stereotypes, we can see how women of color, particularly black women, were not treated with the same delicate reserve and expectations that their white counterparts received. Furthermore, black men were also not privy to the same standards white men were held to, often being disregarded, disrespected, and in many cases stripped of their humanity completely. Through the sources I've chosen to analyze, it is apparent not only that these stereotypes were inaccurate, but also that they were crucial in the efforts of white Americans to rewrite history and to push black Americans into a box. While the narrative told through literature and film of white Southern women in the 19th century depicts them as gentle and gregarious, true accounts tend to reveal a more sinister story. Historian Stephanie Jones Rogers gives an account of the violence young Southern women were taught to inflict upon enslaved people in their homes. White females projected techniques of slave discipline and management and decided what kind of slave owners they wanted to become. In Southern society, the ownership of other human beings became a rite of passage to young girls, numbing them to the violence, abuse, and inhumanity of the practice. Not dissimilar to the common tradition today of giving a child a car on their 16th birthday, slave-owning parents gave enslaved men, women, and children to their young daughters as gifts on special occasions like birthdays and Christmas. This practice was effective not only in teaching young mistresses the privilege and roles of their race, but also in educating young enslaved people on the limitations to their existence. However, the practice of teaching young girls to become disciplinarians tended to go against the narrative of the ideal Southern belle. Historian Thavolia Glimpf sheds light on the story not as often told about white Southern women. White women's violence contradicted prevailing concepts of white womanhood, and still does. In her essay, Women in Slavery, The Gender of Violence, Glimpf shares stories of the horrific violence white women were capable of when lashing out against enslaved women and children. Time and time again, interviewees told tales of pain and suffering inflicted by their white mistresses, noting that many of them took voyeuristic pleasure in observing their pain. While the narrative of the cruel master is widely known and accepted in history classes, we often hear little about the cruelty imposed by white women. Yet, even in these accounts, mistresses are named more brutal and sadistic. These narratives contradict the ways we have come to understand white Southern womanhood, and for good reasoning. White women needed to be seen as fragile, timid, and delicate, the antithesis of white men. The fragile balance of the people-owning people society relied on the narratives of white patriarchy. That is, the man is the sole provider for the rather incapable woman. To admit that white Southern women were just as, if not more, brutal and sadistic than their male counterparts, the delicate system would no longer make sense. There would be little justification for the roles of women in their domestic sphere alone. Women, an inferior gender, could not own property, but if it was widely accepted that women were just as cruel to their human property as men, then this system would appear hypocritical. In the end, history is written by the oppressor. The idea that white women were gentle and passive when it came to the ownership of people is the narrative those in power wanted to have remembered. Southern womanhood existed in complexities. While the main yet false narrative surrounding Southern women was of their gentle nature and neediness, this only applied to white women. Black Southern women were not placed on a pedestal and regarded for their poise and beauty. The contradiction of femininity along lines of color is explored in Sojourner Truth's iconic speech, Ain't I a Woman?, wherein she says, "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody helps me into carriages, over mud puddles, or gives me the best place, and ain't I a woman?" Truth points out the dichotomies that existed in the ideals of Southern womanhood. Black women, both enslaved and free, were not treated with the same grace and respect as white women, and yet they were still seen as inferior to men of any race. The idea that black women were not regarded with the privilege of the petticoat plays into the deeper reasoning behind their treatment. Society refused to treat black women as white women were treated in an attempt to dehumanize them. To be a woman in Southern society was, as Truth described, to be helped and doted on. By refusing to adhere the same kind of respect to black women, Southern society was refusing to acknowledge their womanhood, and, in a way, then stripping them of their personhood. This refusal to see black people as members of society was not reserved for black women only. Black men were also stripped of their masculinity. Henry Turner, a representative of Georgia's statewide black convention, faced discrimination when his white colleagues voted to expel all black members in 1868. In an address to the legislature, Turner famously asked, "The great question, sir, is this: am I a man? If I am such, I claim the rights of a man. Am I not a man because I happen to be of darker hue than the honorable gentlemen around me?" Turner points out that his unfair treatment due to the color of his skin has led to him being emasculated. The rights he should be able to claim as a man are limited due to his race. In the same way, Sojourner Truth spoke of society dehumanizing her by refusing to treat her like a woman. Henry Turner is being dehumanized when his society refuses to respect him as a man. By placing black men and women in separate boxes than their white counterparts, society effectively was able to keep them from fighting against their oppression. Instead of black women being able to join the fight of early feminists who wanted to be seen as equal to men, black women had to fight to even be seen as women in society. Instead of black men being able to fight for equal legislation, they had to fight to be recognized for their humanity. The stereotypes that were created in pre- and post-antebellum society have prevailed to this day as harmful tropes for both black and white women and black men. Because our historical narratives of white women fail to hold them accountable to the atrocities they are guilty of when it comes to the participation in the slavery system, they are often still remembered and treated as innocent. Culture still sees white women as needy and incapable of vicious acts of cruelty. For centuries, white women have gotten away with false accusations towards men of color, and their acts of hatred and discrimination often go overlooked or unnoticed. On the other hand, black women were forced into a separate box. Stereotypes placed on black women do not label them as dainty, needy, or beautiful. Black women are seen as angry or mannish. This has been very harmful to the community, as it forces black women to either become complicit about the unfair ways in which they are being treated, or if they do dare to speak out or fight back, they are quickly labeled angry, irrational, or hysterical, feeding into the cruel stereotypes. Furthermore, in placing black women and white women on opposite sides of a gendered expectation has led to increased struggles in the feminist movement. White women have historically advocated for rights and freedoms that are in contrast to the needs of women of color. When white women fought for the freedom to work, they overlooked their sisters of color who had to work out of necessity and received cruel treatment and unfair wages. When white women fought for reproductive rights and freedoms, especially the rights to abortion and sterilization, women of color were fighting against forced sterilizations. The plight of women has historically been divided by race. White women always had the privilege of appearing dainty, even when it was not true in reality. Black women had to fight to be seen as human. In the same way, black men had to work hard to be treated by society as masculine and respected. Their humanity was also often disregarded by a society that chose to privilege white men and women. The repercussions of these early stereotypes regarding gender and race live on and can still be seen today, but it is important to understand the more accurate narratives, not just the ones who have been historically powerful, want us to remember.